a private detective named Howard Stein was hired to investigate the mysterious case of Mr. Irvin David, who just suddenly went missing. Irvin was last seen entering his condo unit and never left since. Their condominium was well equipped with cameras recording 24/7, but none of them had a record of him leaving the premises. Irvin was an art appraiser by trade, and his apartment was filled with stacks of items that were waiting to be evaluated. One of those items was an old painting leaned against the wall. While Detective Howard was looking around the unit, he noticed something strange about it. The painting was a dark scenery of a dreary place that was enveloped by fog. When he walked past the painting, the angle of the picture had changed as if he was looking at a window. Assuming that it was some kind of illusion, Detective Howard took a closer look at the painting. He was completely dumbfounded when he felt a breeze coming from it. The landscape painting was a standard canvas size of 32 by 28 inches, and the old wooden frame was roughly just an inch and a half. Howard slightly tilted it down to see if there was anything behind it. The perspective of the landscape image was changing as he moved it, and there was no trick to it at all. He sat in front of it while trying to figure out how it was even physically possible, and it was then when he noticed something move from the foggy backdrop. Goosebumps crawled all over his skin when he saw a grotesque, otherworldly giant lurking in the background. He realized that the picture of this gloomy landscape was not an ordinary painting of a scenery. It was a drawing of a realistic yet surreal space of a completely different world. He moved closer and closer to the painting until his face was already just a couple of inches away from it, and he fell on his bottom when a hideous quadrupedal humanoid suddenly walked by and turned its head to his direction. Its skin was purplish pale with red veins all over, and it stood on all fours with its back legs folded backwards. Its bulging eyes were completely black and set far apart. Its thin and patchy hair was like that of a pig's, and it was also groaning like one. But despite of all these bizarre features, its face and body structure were still mostly of a human's. Detective Howard was taken aback. He immediately rolled away to hide from this otherworldly fiend's line of sight. It moved closer to the frame and took a peek around the room while Howard leaned right at the side of the painting. He was having cold sweats while hearing the subtle grunts of the creature. He unholstered his gun in fear that it might cross over. Luckily, it just walked away after a while. Detective Howard frantically grabbed the sheet from the bed and put it over the painting to cover the view. For the first time in his career, he was extremely frightened and didn't know what to do. Because of the paranormal nature of the case, he already had a pretty good idea where Irvin David could be. There was no footage of him walking out of the building, and there was no evidence of a forced entry inside the unit. Whether he walked right in or was taken by force, the appraiser was most likely inside the painting. It was a part of Detective Howard's job to bring him back, dead or alive, but he was reluctant to proceed any further for obvious reasons. With those hideous creatures and giants in the fog, the chances of the subject surviving were low. He was thinking that the same thing would also happen to him if he decided to go through with it. However, Detective Howard was quite desperate. He was on a losing streak, and his reputation in the field was far from impressive. He desperately wanted to solve this one and make a name for himself. He had been through several life-threatening situations, but building resolve to face an unknown world was harder than anything he had handled before. The detective mustered all his courage and slowly removed the sheet off the painting. With a gun in his hand, he tested if the barrel could pass through the picture, and it did. He made sure that the creature he saw earlier was not around. One careful step at a time, he went inside the frame and into the world of the unknown. Aside from the dark and gloomy scenery, the first thing he noticed was the density of the air. It felt so heavy as if he was several feet underwater. The fog was so thick that it was so difficult to see the surroundings. The overwhelming expanse of this dark world was far greater than he could have imagined, and the inhabitants of this realm were both hideous and astounding. He could hear some grunting, hissing, and growls from afar, but it was hard to locate where they were. Howard panicked and ran aimlessly into the fog. As he was running, he heard a large explosion nearby. He also noticed the high humidity of the area, and then he realized that the fog which enshrouded the realm was comparable to the mist caused by a volcanic activity. However, he soon discovered that the ones responsible for this blinding mist was not a volcano. The detective heard a number of rapid footsteps coming from below, and he found himself on the edge of a cliff extending above a gully. Inside the gully were a small group of large, odd-looking beings that looked more like animated plants than any kind of animal. It had numerous tentacles underneath a plump bud which appeared to be its head, and it was at least 12 feet tall with translucent skin. Due to its massive size, it was moving so slow across the ground. Few seconds later, a pack of humanoid creatures which Howard saw earlier suddenly appeared from different sides. It looked like they were trying to eat this plant-like creature as they were sinking their teeth on its tentacles. These fiends were like parasites of this world who would attack anything that moves, but the moving bud had a peculiar way of defending itself from its predators. Its bud-like head started expanding like a balloon frog, and it emitted a damaging heat. Some of the fiends ran away, but there were a few who were quite persistent and didn't let go. It grew bigger and bigger until it was already twice its original size, and then it exploded. The explosion let out a ringing bang along with some green acid that burnt the humanoids who made contact with it. The tentacles just kept on moving forward as it began to regrow another bud on top of it. These explosive plant-like beings were all over the place, and they were the ones responsible for the thick mist. Howard was profoundly astounded by what he just witnessed, but his astonishment was rudely cut off when one of the humanoid fiends saw him. This dark and surreal world was clearly too dangerous for humans, especially when these quadrupedal freaks were running around like a pack of hungry hyenas. One of them tried to ambush the detective from behind, and it was then when he made a very big mistake. The humanoid fiend squealed and grunted like a wild boar in front of Howard, and then it aggressively lunged towards him with its sharp fangs ready for a big bite. The detective instinctively reacted by firing his gun. He was able to kill it by shooting it right into the head, but the gunshot had caught the attention of countless more fiends lurking around. When Howard realized his mistake, he ran as fast as he possibly could while a mob of humanoid beasts started tailing him within the thick mist. He climbed a mound of rubble with what looked like a tree made of intertwining bones on top of it. He squeezed through the tight gaps as the fiends tried to reach for him, but some of them were able to climb, and the detective relentlessly fired his gun to those who got too close. All of a sudden, the ground shook as thunderous footsteps began to approach. The fiends scattered in panic as a majestic six-legged giant slowly emerged from the enveloping fog. It was impossibly tall that he couldn't even see its features clearly. The imposing presence of this giant was so immense that the detective froze in fear and bewilderment. It reached for the humanoid fiends who tried to get away as fast as they could, but its reach far surpassed their speed. It didn't matter how fast they could move their little limbs since they were still within the giant's reach, and they were effortlessly caught by its arms that looked like moving roots of a giant tree. After catching a few of the fiends, the colossal creature went back into the fog and did not bother with the human's presence. Detective Howard was so flabbergasted by what just happened that he didn't notice the corpse lying behind him right away. Based on its tattered clothes and hair color, the dead body was no other than Irvin David. It seemed that he also climbed this bone tree to get away from the humanoid creatures, and he cowered in there until he died. Perhaps Detective Howard would have met the same fate if not for the giant's interjection. He waited for the right moment and climbed down when the area was clear, and he cautiously retraced his path back to the entryway while constantly remaining hidden. Unfortunately, his movements was slowed down by the corpse that he brought with him. Few moments later, he was spotted by a gang of fiends once again, but this time around, he just ran as fast as his legs could take him instead of shooting at them. The humanoid beasts came lunging from every side, and the detective was shaking them off while trying not to make so much noise. The last thing he wanted was to draw even more attention, and he had to endure the attacks as much as he could. It took roughly an hour before he was able to see the entryway. The detective jumped back in as dozens of vile creatures were still chasing after him. Once he was able to return to Irvin's room, Howard immediately grabbed the painting and repeatedly smashed it on the floor. A couple of fiends were still trying to reach for him while the canvas was being torn. When the painting was ruined completely, the path to the other world was broken. Detective Howard Stein was able to retrieve the body of Irvin David despite of the case's inconceivably difficult circumstance. He reported everything that happened, but his senior and the other detectives did not believe his statement. The relatives of the subject were grateful for his effort, but they also questioned the paranormal elements of his report. All that remained of the only evidence he had was a torn canvas and a broken frame. However, Detective Howard's curiosity about this paranormal case did not wane. Few months later, he started to investigate the origin of the painting and the whereabouts of its former owners.